war on drugs refers to a series of actions that began in 1969, leading to the prohibition of illegal drug trade. The term was coined by Richard Nixon when he described illegal drugs as public enemy number one in the United States.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The government and military became heavily involved in the campaign, mainly to stop the crack epidemic. By the time Ronald Reagan took office, the war on drugs was very prominent in American society and influenced most aspects of life for the public. Although the war on drugs was morally correct, it was a failure because it helped incarcerate minority groups, it boosted conflict overseas, and it was expensive.
The war on drugs mainly focuses on the crack epidemic. But what is crack, what is cocaine, and how are they different? Cocaine is a stimulant drug that comes from coca leaves. It is addictive and harmful to the body. Crack is the most addictive form of cocaine, and it is very concentrated. It is made by mixing cocaine, water, and baking soda. It is possible to become addicted after one smoke. While they both have a similar relative chemical makeup, crack is much more dangerous than cocaine. Cocaine is found in a powdered form and can be snorted or injected. On the other hand, crack comes in a rock form and can only be smoked. Another key difference between the drugs is that crack is much cheaper than powder cocaine, making it an affordable high for many users.
Because of this, crack was more popular among the inner cities and minority groups, while cocaine mainly made its way into the hands of the wealthy in the suburbs. Many politicians who were focused on boosting their own agendas supported harsher punishments for smoking crack than snorting cocaine. This created racial tension within society as incarceration laws targeted minorities for their drug possession. Possession of 5 grams of crack led to an automatic 5-year prison sentence, while it took 500 grams of cocaine to have the same effect. Incarceration rates among minorities were exponentially higher than those of the wealthy population.
In this chart, the blue represents the percentage of illegal drug users per race, while the red represents the percent of the prison population per drug for drug crimes. As you can see, there was a disparity between minority and white incarceration rates. Even though the majority of drug users were white, more minorities were imprisoned for those same crimes. During Reagan's years, prison penalties for drug crimes skyrocketed, and this trend continued for many years. In fact, according to drugpolicy.org, the number of people incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997.
In addition, economics expert Jeff Disheartens claims that the U.S. spent 58% less money to educate a child than it did to keep an inmate behind bars. The government spent around $12.6 billion per year to keep prisoners behind bars. Because of the mass incarcerations, Nancy Reagan started the Just Say No campaign, aimed to deter children from drugs. While this was noble, it was a relatively ineffective campaign. It did raise awareness of the drug issue within the United States, but it did not reduce the amount of people who used drugs.
As shown, harsher incarceration laws and the focus on the deterrence of drugs resulted in more problems for society and an ineffective plan to fix the drug epidemic. In Portugal, the government went in the opposite direction of the United States by decriminalizing the use of all drugs in 2001 and unleashed a major public health campaign to tackle addiction. After 17 years, Portugal has proved to be more successful as the number of Portuguese dying from the overdoses plunged by 85%, while the United States' deaths from overdoses totals around 64,000, which is more deaths than the U.S. suffered in the Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq wars combined. This shows how the U.S. used an ineffective method of deterrence from drugs.
In addition to the social and domestic issues caused by the drug war, there were major international and political problems as well. First, notorious drug trafficker Pablo Escobar was highly active in his business with the Medellin cartel throughout this time. According to expert Richard Samuels, Escobar controlled over 80% of the cocaine shipped into the United States and had a lot of power, money, and influence.
When I started, a 1 kilo grass bust was cause for celebration. Before long, we were seizing 60 kilos of coke a day. We felt we were making a huge difference. Truth is, we weren't even making a dent. They let us have 60 so they could bring in 600. Pablo's coke flooded in. It didn't take long for Miami to get addicted, and I mean that. It was like the whole city was running around trying to get this shit. And with the money came the violence.
In addition to the smuggling methods shown in the video, Escobar was able to smuggle millions of dollars worth of cocaine through Panama, where leader General Manuel Noriega openly allowed the trade.
These illicit dealings caused Nixon to create the Drug Enforcement Administration, known as the DEA, to crack down on illegal smuggling. During the war on drugs, the DEA expanded by opening 221 offices throughout the United States and 86 offices in 67 countries around the world. According to DEA records, it was funded an annual budget of $2.88 billion in 2015. But was the DEA really effective for all the money that was put in? For example, in 2005, the DEA reported that they had seized $1.4 billion in drug trade assets and $477 million worth of drugs, while the White House Office of Drug Control Policy estimated in the same year that the total value of all the drugs sold in the United States was as much as $64 billion.
With the credibility of the drug war declining due to its relative ineffectiveness, the public began to question whether or not it was worth the funding. Reagan's reputation was further hurt after the Iran-Contra scandal, which was exposed in 1987. Basically, Reagan and a government official, Oliver North, went behind Congress's back and secretly sold weapons to Iran, which was illegal at the time. In return, they got money and hostages. While the US did not gain from this, it was a poor decision by Reagan and North because they negotiated with terrorists and used the money for even more illegal activity. They sent the money to the other side of the world, in Nicaragua, where the communist Sandistas were fighting against the rebel Contras. In hopes of containing communism, Reagan and North used the Iran money to fund the rebels.
However, in order to continue funding the weapons for the Contras, North and Reagan facilitated the sale of $14 million worth of drugs to the United States, shown here in the note written by North himself. Not only did this exacerbate the crack epidemic, but it heavily tarnished the credibility of the war on drugs. As shown in this chart, Reagan's approval rating by the public declined heavily following the Iran-Contra scandal. Because his approval fell, the campaign against drugs was also hurt in the process.
Let's hear how this war is still going on today through the perspective of famous hip-hop artist Jay-Z, who grew up in the 1980s during the peak of the war.
People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest-growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared the so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
It took the U.S. Judicial Department until 1995 to acknowledge that it discriminated minority groups in the drug war, but any proposal for change was shut down by Congress. Congress cracked down on the Colombia drug cartels by killing Pablo Escobar and sending financial aid, which eased overseas tensions. Since the beginning of the war on drugs in 1971, the U.S. has spent $1 trillion to fund it, And the war is arguably still going on today with the debate on the legalization of marijuana in different states. So, while it did have moral intent, the war on drugs failed because it was discriminatory, it contributed to overseas conflict, and it was expensive for the United States.